Okay, ciao ragazzi, this is Mr. Keki. Let's look at part 2 of making nouns plural, more specifically Grammatica 3.a. This is a video where I go into a little bit further detail of some of the more complicated aspects of nouns in Italian. This is by no means a complete list of all of the issues with nouns in Italian, but it just kind of takes um, us to the next level of where many of the nouns that we've seen belong. So let's look at some of those more irregular, more difficult concepts. So just as a quick review, you don't add s to make a noun plural in Italian. Instead, you make some of these changes, and this is just this table I put in the last video. Many students find it helpful when you abbreviate a little bit. So if a noun ends with the letter O, you change it to I. If it ends with A, you change it to E. If it ends with E, you change it to I when it's plural. And let's get into that more specifically. If a noun ends with the letter O, that means it's masculine, and we change the O to I. In the examples, libro, zaino, and ragazzo, those all change to libri, zaini, and ragazzi. Nouns that end with the letter A change to E. Okay, so these two slides would be great if this is all we needed to know for nouns in Italian, but unfortunately there's a little bit more to it than that. And the biggest component are these nouns that are singular that end with the letter E, and when they change to plural, the E changes to an I. And this is problematic because, as we see from this chart here, you do have nouns that end with the letter E, like these that we just saw that are masculine or feminine singular, but we also have nouns that end with E that can be feminine, plural. And if that wasn't clear, let's go back into more detail. So we know that nouns that end with ORE are masculine, like professore, and nouns that end with ione are feminine, like lezione, and ice, like calcolatrice, are feminine. Any other noun that ends with the letter E, we would need some other context clues, but just for the sake of today's lesson, it's more about understanding what happens with these nouns that are singular that ends with the letter E. Okay, so keep in mind the following information. So we looked at some nouns that end with the letter A, like lavagna and matita. Those nouns, when they become plural, the A changes to an E. Lavagna becomes lavagne. Chalkboard becomes chalkboards. Matita becomes matite. Pencil becomes pencils. So with that information, you can see that nouns that end with the letter E can be feminine plural. However, we also saw some nouns that are singular and end with the letter E. And these can be feminine singular or masculine singular, like classe is feminine singular, and professore is masculine singular, etc. So nouns that end in E can also be feminine singular, right? And masculine singular. So nouns that end with E can be all of these. They can be feminine plural, they can become feminine singular, or even masculine singular. And when that's the case, it causes some other problems with the grammar. But as far as we know today, we just know that nouns that end with the letter E can be any of these in these categories. The other category of noun that can be somewhat confusing are nouns that end with the letter I. So we know that nouns that end with the letter O are masculine singular, and those change to I when they are plural, like libro becomes libri, and quaderno becomes quaderni. So nouns that end with the letter I can be masculine plural. But there are all of those nouns that are singular and end with the letter E also change to I when they're plural. And some of those are masculine, like professore, but some of those are feminine, like calcolatrice, which becomes calculatrici. So if we can have nouns that are feminine as well, basically we have to be able to deduce that nouns that end in I are always plural, but they can be masculine or feminine. So quaderno becomes quaderni, it's masculine. Professori is masculine because we know the singular is professore. Calcolatrici is feminine because we know that the singular form calcolatrice is feminine. And lezioni is feminine because we know it ends with ione when it's singular, and therefore it's feminine. That's the first thing I wanted to review with these nouns, the more complicated aspects of these nouns. We talked in the last video about nouns that end with consonants, and they don't make any changes, so I wanted to just touch upon that briefly. So these nouns, they don't make any changes when they're plural: computer, sport, film. So how do you know when it's singular or plural? Well, there's a variety of context clues that'll help us out with it. One of the most obvious is just counting the number of objects. So if I say to you, io ho due computer, you should remember that you know those words already this year. So I have 2 computers. Why is it computers? Why is it plural? Well, because it has the number 2 in front of it, and that's the clue there. So sometimes the context clues are that straightforward. And this happens also with nouns and with accented vowels. Don't make any changes when it's plural. Città stays as città, city, cities. Università, università, university, universities. Caffè, caffè, coffee, coffees. And so if I read you a sentence, prendo 3 caffè, so even though that word caffè can be coffee or coffees, because I'm saying I'll have 3 of them, then I'm making it plural, 3 coffees. And this is something I did not talk about in the last video, but I just wanted to explain it a little bit further. There are some spelling changes that happen with a lot of the nouns that we've seen already. More specifically, there are a few nouns in the unit on classroom objects that fall into these categories. So let's look into some more detail. So the first category are nouns that end with the letters I, O, io. So if we look at a couple of examples in vocabulary 8, classroom objects, we see astuccio, which means pencil case, and orologio, which means clock or clocks. So when they change to plural, they end with the letter I because they're masculine singular, and when they're masculine plural, the O changes to an I. But notice, if you look in greater detail, notice that we didn't actually change the O to I. We just dropped the O. And the reason why we did that is because we wouldn't want to have 2 I's at the end of that noun, which I wrote over here, astucci, which can look weird, even though it's not completely abnormal. Because there are moments where you would use a double I, like in the word zio, which means uncle, and we change it to Z for uncles. So there is a rule to follow with this double I, and that is if the stress in that word falls on that I at the end of a word, like if a word ends with io, and the stress falls on that I, then you would add the double I. So it's zio. So if we listen to that word zio, the syllable that's being stressed is the zi, zio. But if we look at these words up here, astuccio, this word astuccio, the u is being stressed, so we don't add the double I. Orologio, this O is being stressed, so we don't add a double I. So that's the rule for it, and if you want to look at those details, definitely pause the video and go back and look again. The other spelling change that occurs are with nouns that end with CO, GO, CA, and GA. And I put these all into one category because it's basically the same reason. We want to keep that sound, the original sound in the singular verb, singular noun. Sorry. In the letter C often makes the K sound in Italian, but it does change when we add an I or an E. And if we do that carelessly, we change the sound of the word. And so, for example, in the word banco, which is in vocabulary 8, in order to make the plural banchi, we need to add an H there, otherwise it's pronounced differently. Same thing happens with the word amica, amiche, albergo, alberghi, and then another word in vocabulary 8 for ruler, riga. To say righe, we need to add the H there. If we don't add these H's in the plural forms, the sound becomes soft, like banchi or amice or albergi or rige, which is not how these words are pronounced in Italian.